Hello and welcome to another TLDR global video, where we continue our mini-series on disputed land claims. This follows on from our last video where we outlined the myriad claims that different countries have on Antarctica. Although we explained the claims in that video, we've left it till this one to explain what the claims actually mean in reality, how they're enforced, if they are, and why countries may be so keen on making these claims and legitimizing them. Essentially, how laws work on the continent despite this mess of countries claiming jurisdiction. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. We've only recently started the TLDR Global channel, but already we've covered what global debt is, how China's richest man disappeared, and Ethiopia's ongoing civil war. To be updated on global issues as they happen, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. So when it comes to Antarctic law, let's start with the most obvious piece of international law on which all law in Antarctica is based, the Antarctic Treaty. This was signed in 1959 by 12 nations and has now been signed by 54 nations. And it's been regarded as one of the most successful international treaties ever. The treaty prohibits a wide range of activities, such as any activity of a military nature and any nuclear explosions on the continent. It details what these things mean, it has systems for disputes between countries, and specifies that nations should meet every 30 years to review the document. The really interesting part of the treaty relates to sovereign land, though. The treaty claims that nothing contained in the present treaty shall be interpreted as the renunciation by any contracting party of previously asserted rights of or claims to territorial sovereignty in Antarctica. This basically means that the treaty does not undo any of the claims that nations have made across Antarctica. Their national laws, though, cannot supersede the treaty. This doesn't really help any of the sovereignty claims, though. For a country to enforce laws, taxes, etc. on an area of land, other countries have to recognise that claim. If countries don't recognise each other's claims, then things get a lot more complex. However, if your country recognises another nation's claim, then when you're in that area, you're effectively in their sovereign state. This was demonstrated when an Australian astrophysicist died in the New Zealand territory of Antarctica. Although it was believed that he died of natural causes, an autopsy was conducted in New Zealand, where his body was transported to. This is because Australia recognises New Zealand's claim, most likely because they recognise Australia's in return. In the autopsy, it turned out that Rodney Marks, the Australian astrophysicist, had died of methanol poisoning. The New Zealand police never actually found out who had committed the crime. This mutual recognition can be seen in other places too, though, with the UK, France, Australia, New Zealand and Norway all recognising each other's claims to territory in Antarctica, likely because none of their claims overlap. So a similar procedure would have happened if it had been an Englishman, a Frenchman or a Norwegian that died in New Zealand's territory. However, if your country doesn't recognise the claims in Antarctica, then you're considered to be in international waters. The rules of which we discussed in the first video of this series. Very basically though, you must follow the rules of your home country, although you can be tried in another country if you harm one of their citizens. This contrast in which rules you have to follow was best shown in a crime committed in Antarctica in 1959. At the Vostok station, which was owned and maintained by the USSR, two scientists played a game of chess. The loser became enraged and hit the other man with an ICEPICK. Although there's dispute over whether this was murder or not, the person never faced trial in New Zealand, which is the section of Antarctica where the Vostok station was based. Although it's not clear, this is likely because the USSR and subsequently Russia didn't recognise any claims in Antarctica. This meant that they dealt with their own citizens without ever informing New Zealand. This actually leads us to another interesting point. Both Russia and the US refuse to accept any other country's claims in Antarctica, but they do reserve the right to make their own claims. Therefore, to any Russian or US citizen, Antarctica is international waters, and they must follow the laws of their respective country. However, we're not legal experts, so don't try and start a criminal empire in Antarctica and blame us when you're in court. We have student loans to pay, and we really don't need to pay a lawyer too. However, on the topic of Russia and the US's notable absence from this continent, If either were to make a new territorial claim, as they say they have the right to do, they would be breaking the Antarctic Treaty. Under the territorial claims section of the treaty, it states that no new claim or enlargement of an existing claim to territorial sovereignty shall be asserted while the present treaty is in force. So if either Russia or the US wanted to make a claim, they would be breaking the Antarctic Treaty, unless they first pulled out of it. But doing so would be no small thing, considering this treaty has preserved the continent from being another theatre of war over the last half-century. Another option would be to amend the treaty, but this also doesn't seem likely. Unless Russia or the US wanted to claim the small portions of Antarctica that are currently unclaimed, they'd have to claim another nation's Antarctic land, and that's a whole different can of worms. While they could pressure other nations into backing their claim, considering only the nations who have claims themselves recognise each other, this would be quite the diplomatic mission. But why do countries even care about claims and national laws in Antarctica? Isn't it all just ice and polar bears anyway? Well, no. According to some reports, there's a hell of a lot of oil in Antarctica. Some estimates put the amount of oil at around 200 billion barrels, more than Kuwait or Abu Dhabi. Although it currently seems that mining for oil in Antarctica would cost more than the value of the barrels of oil, who knows where things could be in the future. The value of oil, however, isn't the only thing stopping nations from mining in Antarctica though. In 1991, the Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Atlantic Treaty was signed, which explicitly banned any mineral mining except for scientific purposes. Although the protocol was signed in 1991, it came into force in 1998. One of the provisions in it stipulated that the document could be reviewed by signatories in 50 years' time, which takes us to 2048. If enough nations agreed to change it though, commercial drilling could happen sooner. Not only this, but Antarctica is a strategic location for GPS satellite receivers, and this could be used for civilian purposes or military ones. Therefore, many nations see it as being in their interest to bolster their claims in Antarctica. Russia's built bases all over the continent, and this could be used to argue in 2048 that as no nation has stopped them or commented on their bases, that these claims of sovereignty do not or no longer exist. The US has also built bases on the continent, conveniently inside all territorial claims in Antarctica. Again, they could use this to argue that as none of the nations have stopped them or commented on them building within their sovereign territory just doesn't exist. As we also mentioned in our previous video, China has started to steadily increase their presence in the region. However, Forbes has pointed out that this increase does not put them even close to the operations run by other countries. In 2018-19, China managed to send around 180 researchers to 4 Antarctic territories. At the same time, Chile deployed 450 researchers to 11 stations. Forbes makes the argument that China's doing this mainly for show. It's an attempt to convince the world that they have a presence in Antarctica, and if the continent's carved up in 2048, they deserve a large amount of the spoils. A good example of this is from 2016, when international inspectors reviewed China's Great Wall Station. They were impressed by the visitor centre, but found that the 2 concrete beams that were designed to control fuel spills were crumbling after only 2 years of use. Another example is the fact that China's icebreaker got stuck and actually needed American support to be broken free. All of this international posturing, though, assumes that the rules will change in 2048. This isn't necessarily the case, though, and nations may want to continue preserving the Antarctic and abide by one of the most successful international treaties ever to be signed. For now though, if you're from one of the countries who recognise each other's claims, then you'll want to follow the laws of the respective countries when within their territory. If you're from any other country though, then being on the continent is equivalent to international waters, so you're following your own country's laws, unless your rule breaking impacts people from other countries, in which case things get dicey, so maybe don't smack someone round the head with an ice pick, or you know what, just avoid chess altogether. But what do you think? Do you think that the Antarctic Treaty should be amended? Should the Antarctic claims for nations be upheld? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel to be updated every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.